You're standing in the Forum, and the crowd is silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the suffocating quiet that comes when thousands of people are too horrified to speak. The sun is high over Rome, 73 years before the Common Era, and you can smell blood mixing with dust in the summer heat. In front of you, a man is being torn apart. Not quickly, not mercifully. The Roman state has engineered this moment with the precision of architects designing a temple, except what they're building here is a spectacle of absolute dominance. Your stomach turns, but you can't look away. No one can. That's the point. Welcome to the machinery of Roman punishment, where cruelty wasn't just permitted, it was systematized, legalized, and in some cases considered sacred duty. What you're about to discover isn't just a list of brutal practices. It's the blueprint for how an empire used terror as infrastructure, how they coded suffering into law, and why the worst of what they did had to be erased, not because Romans were ashamed, but because the truth was too dangerous to remember. If this is gripping you, hit like and subscribe, because the next part gets worse. But before you understand why these punishments were erased, you need to understand what made Roman justice different from every other ancient system. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't the chaos of barbarian raids or the impulsive cruelty of mad kings. Roman punishment was legal theory made flesh. It had categories, procedures, paperwork. The Romans built an entire philosophical framework to justify who suffered, how they suffered, and most importantly, who got to watch. Here's what made it systematic. Roman law divided people into clear hierarchies: citizens, non-citizens, slaves, foreigners. And the punishment you received didn't depend primarily on your crime. It depended on your status. A Roman citizen who stole bread faced a fine. A slave who stole bread could be crucified. Same act, different body, different law. The machine sorted people first, then decided how to break them. And here's the thing. The Romans documented everything. They were obsessive record keepers, carving laws into bronze, maintaining archives, writing legal commentaries that filled libraries. Yet certain punishments appear in the historical record only as fragments, references, things mentioned once and never elaborated. Sometimes a single line in Tacitus, a passing comment in Suetonius, a legal text that describes the punishment's abolition but never quite explains what it was. That absence isn't accidental. Those gaps were engineered. Now the first one. You're a deserter from the legions. It's 117 before the Common Era, and Rome is fighting in North Africa. You ran. Maybe you were terrified. Maybe you were starving. Maybe you just wanted to see your family again. It doesn't matter. They caught you, and now you're standing in formation with 9 other men who made the same mistake. Your centurion is walking down the line with a bag of stones. He stops in front of the man next to you, reaches into the bag, and pulls out a black stone. That man's legs give out. You understand why a moment later. This is decimation. 1 man in 10, chosen by lottery, beaten to death by the other 9. The Latin is clear. Decimatio, from decem, meaning 10. But here's what makes it worse than simple execution. The men who kill you aren't executioners. They're your tent mates. The soldiers you've marched with, eaten with, fought beside for years. The Roman command structure just turned your brothers into your murderers. And if they refuse, if they don't beat you hard enough, don't break your skull thoroughly enough, they take his place. Think about the logic. 1 act of cowardice becomes 9 acts of forced complicity. The unit that failed Rome now fails each other. Trust is shattered at the molecular level. And when it's over, the legion doesn't just have 1 fewer soldier. It has 9 men who will never forget what their own hands did. That trauma is the point. It's punishment as social engineering. The historical record on decimation is strange. We have multiple accounts of it happening. Polybius describes it. Plutarch mentions it. But after the early empire, the sources go quiet. Not because it stopped. References suggest it continued in various forms well into the 3rd century of the Common Era, but because documenting it became politically inconvenient. An empire that prided itself on discipline and order didn't want to advertise that its legendary military cohesion was built on forcing soldiers to murder each other. Now the next one, and this is where the sexual politics of Rome become a weapon. You're a Vestal virgin, and you've been accused of breaking your vow of chastity. The year is approximately 114 before the Common Era. You might be guilty. You might be the victim of political conspiracy. When Rome needed a scapegoat for military defeats or natural disasters, accusing a Vestal was convenient theology. Either way, you're being led to a small underground chamber outside the city walls. It contains a bed, a lamp, bread, water, and milk. Enough to survive for a few days. Then they seal the entrance with earth and stone. You're not being executed. Technically, the state isn't killing you at all. You're being buried alive and left to die of thirst or suffocation or madness, whichever comes first. This is the punishment for unchaste Vestals, and its cruelty is theological. The Vestal virgins weren't just priestesses. They were human guarantees of Rome's contract with the gods. Their chastity literally sustained the state. If that chastity was violated, the entire city was at risk of divine retribution. So the punishment couldn't be simple execution, because that would require the state to spill sacred blood, which would compound the pollution. Instead, they used earth itself as the executioner. The gods would decide when you died. Rome's hands stayed clean. But here's what the sources won't tell you in detail. What happened to the men accused of sleeping with Vestals? They were beaten to death in the Forum, publicly, maximum humiliation. Same crime, radically different punishment. The woman was hidden away, buried in silence, erased from sight. The man was displayed, broken in front of everyone. The logic is gendered to its core. Female sexual transgression polluted in secret and required secret disposal. Male sexual transgression was a public insult and required public destruction. The historical record preserves maybe 4 or 5 specific cases across 5 centuries. That's statistically impossible if this was truly rare. What's more likely is that most cases were handled quietly, or the accusations were used as political leverage and never reached the point of punishment. The erasure here is about power. Admitting how often Rome was willing to bury its priestesses alive would mean admitting how often the state was in theological crisis. And then it gets worse. You're a parricide. You've been convicted of killing your father. The year is written into stone as the time of Emperor Hadrian, approximately 130 of the Common Era. Roman law considered this the most unnatural crime possible, worse than treason, worse than sacrilege, because it violated the foundational hierarchy of the family, which mirrored the hierarchy of the state. Killing your father wasn't just murder, it was cosmic rebellion. So they don't just kill you. They place you in a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. Then they sew the sack shut and throw it into the Tiber. This is poena cullae, the punishment of the sack, and every animal is symbolic. The dog, because you were disloyal like a rabid dog. The rooster, because you were unnatural like a creature that doesn't know its own young. The viper, because you were venomous. The monkey, because you're a mockery of human form. You're not being executed as a person. You're being reclassified as a bestial thing and drowned with other bestial things. Now think about what happens inside that sack. You're in absolute darkness, in water, with animals that are as terrified as you are. The dog bites, the rooster claws, the viper strikes because it's cornered. You're not just drowning, you're being torn apart in a space so small you can't even fight back. And the sack is sewn shut, so there's no escape, no air pocket, no moment of reprieve. It takes minutes, long minutes. The legal texts describe this punishment in procedural detail, what kind of leather, how to sew the sack, which river to use, but they almost never describe what actually happens to the person inside. That silence is deliberate. The law wants you to know the punishment exists, wants you to fear it, but doesn't want you to think too carefully about the mechanics of forcing a human being into a small space with panicking animals and drowning them. Because if you think about it too carefully, you start asking questions about proportionality, about humanity, about whether any state should have this power. Poena cullae was formally abolished by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century of the Common Era, but the legal code that abolished it barely explains what it was. The assumption is that everyone already knew. But that means for 1,000 years, Roman legal education included teaching young jurists the step-by-step process for drowning people in sacks with animals. That's not just a punishment. That's institutional memory of cruelty. Now watch what happens when punishment becomes entertainment. You're a condemned criminal, and you've been sentenced to fight in the arena. But you're not a gladiator. Gladiators are trained, valuable, often celebrated. Your damnatio ad bestias, condemned to the beasts. It's the afternoon show at the Colosseum, roughly 85 of the Common Era, and you're being driven into the sand with whips. You have no armor, no weapon, sometimes not even clothing. Across the arena, gates are opening, and what comes through depends on what the editors of the games could afford. Lions, bears, bulls, leopards, wild boars. Sometimes animals that have been starved for days. This isn't combat. It's slaughter, choreographed for maximum spectacle. The entire structure of the arena is designed to make escape impossible and visibility perfect. Tens of thousands of people watch you die, and they're eating pastries. Children are watching. Senators are watching. The emperor might be watching. Your death is civic recreation. But here's the thing that makes it worse than simple execution. Sometimes they added theater. They would stage mythological scenes, where the condemned played the role of figures from legend who died horribly. You're not just being killed by a bear. You're playing Orpheus being torn apart by the maenads, except the maenads are actual animals. And you're not playing. The audience gets culture and blood sport in one package. Your death has a script. The sources mention this constantly. Martial, Strabo, Tertullian, all describing beast hunts and executions as routine parts of the games, but they rarely focus on the condemned as people. They're props, set pieces. The detailed records are about the animals, how many lions, how exotic the imports, how much it all cost. The actual humans being torn apart are statistical, mentioned in passing, lumped together as criminals, without names or crimes specified. That erasure is about desensitization. If the crowd thought too hard about who these people were, maybe a thief, maybe a political prisoner, maybe someone who insulted the wrong official, the spectacle loses its entertainment value. And then, there's the version that almost no one talks about. You're a woman condemned to die in the arena, and the script they've chosen is different. It's still mythological theater, but now you're playing Pasiphae, the queen who, according to legend, coupled with a bull. Except this isn't metaphor. Roman sources hint, in fragments, at executions where condemned women were subjected to assault by animals as public spectacle. The sources are vague, deliberately so. Tertullian mentions it in disgust. Martial alludes to it. Apuleius describes something similar in theatrical context. But no official record gives details, because even Romans who accepted mass blood sport as entertainment recognized that this crossed a line they didn't want memorialized. Think about what that means. In a society that documented crucifixions in legal manuals and staged mass killings as festivals, this particular cruelty was considered too disturbing to record clearly. The erasure here isn't about hiding weakness. It's about hiding something that might make even hardened Romans question the system. Now the machinery shifts. You're a slave, and you've struck your master. It doesn't matter if it was self-defense. It doesn't matter if your master was attacking you. The law is absolute. Any slave who raises a hand against a master receives the same sentence: crucifixion. But not just you. Every slave in the household. All of them. This is the logic of collective punishment taken to its ultimate form. When a wealthy Roman named Lucius Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his slaves in the year 61 of the Common Era, the Senate debated what to do with the 400 slaves in his household. Some senators argued for mercy. Surely not all 400 were involved. Surely many were children or elderly or worked in parts of the house where they couldn't have known. But the Senate voted to execute all of them. Not because all were guilty, but because the law required terror to be comprehensive. If slaves couldn't trust that obedience would save them, if they knew one person's rebellion meant everyone's death, they would police each other. The household would become a surveillance state in miniature. Tacitus records this event in detail, including the debate, because it was controversial even by Roman standards. The common people rioted, trying to prevent the execution. But it happened anyway, with military support, because the law required it. And here's what's erased: how often this happened in smaller households that didn't have senators involved. Tacitus records the exceptional case. The routine cases, the households of 10 or 20 slaves all crucified because one struck back, those aren't in the archives. They're assumed, normalized, not worth recording. Crucifixion itself deserves focus here. You think you know what it is. You've seen the imagery. But the Roman version was designed to maximize suffering over time. The nails weren't just for attachment. They were placed to damage nerves, causing constant agony but avoiding major blood vessels so you wouldn't bleed out quickly. The position of the body made breathing difficult. You had to push up on the nails through your feet to expand your lungs, which meant every breath was a choice between suffocation and pain. Death took hours, sometimes days. Dehydration, shock, asphyxiation, all competing to finish you. And it was public. Crucifixions lined the roads outside cities. The Via Appia, the main road to Rome, once held 6,000 crucified prisoners from Spartacus's rebellion, spaced evenly, one every 40 meters, for over 200 kilometers. That's not execution. That's landscape architecture made from corpses. The message was inescapable. This is what happens when you challenge Rome. The legal texts describe crucifixion in procedural terms: how to construct the cross, where to place it, who had authority to order it. But they don't describe the experience. They don't talk about the birds, the insects, the fact that you might be conscious for most of it. That erasure is tactical. If the law made you imagine what it actually felt like, the system might generate sympathy. Better to keep it abstract. Now here's where it becomes about identity. You're a Roman citizen and you've committed a capital crime. Treason, maybe. Murder. It doesn't matter. Because of your citizenship, you cannot be crucified. That punishment is for slaves, for non-citizens, for people whose bodies don't matter. Your body matters because you're Roman. So instead, you're beheaded. Quick. Almost clean. A professional executioner with a sharp sword. One stroke if he's competent. The difference between you and the slave who committed the exact same crime is legal status, and that status determines whether you suffer for hours or seconds. This is the fundamental architecture of Roman punishment. Your body's legal classification determines your pain. The crime is secondary. First, the system asks what you are, then it decides what to do to you. A slave can be tortured to extract testimony. A citizen cannot. A non-citizen can be beaten to death for theft. A citizen faces exile or fines. Same empire, different laws depending on whose skin you're wearing. But here's the part the sources barely touch. What happened to citizens who lost their citizenship? It was possible. Treason could strip citizenship. So could certain religious conversions in the later empire. And once you lost that status, you lost the protections. You could go from beheading to crucifixion with a single legal declaration. Your body didn't change. The law's relationship to your body changed. That vulnerability kept citizens loyal, because citizenship wasn't just an identity. It was armor against the state's full violence. The erasure here is about the edges of the system. The sources preserve the clear cases. Slave versus citizen. Roman versus foreigner. But the ambiguous cases, freedmen, citizens under investigation, people with partial legal status, those get messy. And messy doesn't support the narrative of Roman law as clear, rational, superior. So the mess gets edited out of the official record. And then there's the punishment that wasn't a punishment at all, legally speaking. You're an enemy combatant, and Rome has conquered your city. The year is 146 before the Common Era, and you're in Carthage. The siege is over. Your city fought for 3 years, but it's done now. Roman soldiers are moving through the streets with orders. Not to execute you. That would imply you have the status of a criminal deserving judgment. The orders are simpler: enslavement. Every person in the city, every single one. 50,000 people, maybe more, marched to auction blocks and sold. This isn't punishment in the legal sense. This is policy. The Roman Senate voted to destroy Carthage completely. Buildings burned, soil salted, population dispersed into slavery. It's genocide by another name, but the Romans called it military necessity. And because it wasn't legally classified as punishment, it didn't need to follow any procedural protections. No trial, no appeals, just conquest and sale. The sources record this as historical fact. Polybius describes it, Appian confirms it, but they frame it as strategic success, not moral catastrophe. 50,000 lives converted to property, and the historical record treats it like a logistics achievement. That reframing is the erasure. If you call it punishment, people ask if it was proportional, if it was just. If you call it war, those questions disappear. Now, think about scale. Carthage wasn't unique. When Rome conquered Gaul, Julius Caesar enslaved approximately 1 million people over 8 years of campaign. 1 million. The sources mention this in passing, as evidence of Caesar's military brilliance. The human cost is numerical, not personal. We don't have their names. We don't know which families were separated, which children watched their parents sold, which communities were destroyed. That absence is structural. The historical record was written by Romans, for Romans, about Roman achievements. The enslaved are background. Now the final one, and this is where everything comes together. You're a Christian in the arena at Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon in France, in the year 177 of the Common Era. You've been tortured for days already. They've tried to make you renounce your faith, but you haven't, so now you're in the amphitheater. But your execution isn't simple. First you're scourged, publicly, your back open to bone. Then you're placed in an iron chair that's been heated red hot. Then you're thrown to the beasts. And if you somehow survive that, you're finished with a sword. This is punishment as extended theater, designed not just to kill you, but to break your symbolism. You claimed your God would protect you. Let's test that claim in front of 10,000 witnesses. The letter of the churches of Lyon and Vienne describes this in detail, preserved because the Christian community memorialized their martyrs. But here's what's crucial. The Roman sources don't mention this event at all. It doesn't appear in official records. It's not in the histories. The only reason we know it happened is because the victims' community documented it. That gap is about narrative control. Rome's official history isn't about religious persecution. It's about triumph, order, expansion. The stories that don't fit that narrative get excluded. And here's the revelation at the center of all of this. The punishments weren't erased because Romans were ashamed of them. They were erased because they stopped being useful. When the empire converted to Christianity in the 4th century of the Common Era, the new administration faced a problem. The legal codes were still full of pagan justifications. Punishments designed to appease gods Romans no longer worshipped. Rituals that assumed divine sanction for state violence. So they edited. They kept the structures but removed the explanations. Crucifixion was officially abolished by Constantine, not because it was cruel, but because Christ had died that way, and it was now symbolically inappropriate. The punishment of the sack was modified and eventually banned, not because it was inhumane, but because Christian theology had different ideas about parricide and sin. The erasure was administrative. As the empire shifted ideologies, the legal scholars rewrote the text to fit new frameworks. Old commentaries were copied selectively. Certain precedents were emphasized. Others were allowed to fade. The result is a historical record with holes, not because of time or accident, but because of intentional editing across generations. What survived is what successive regimes found useful. What disappeared is what became inconvenient. And that tells you something crucial about power. It's not enough to control the present. You have to control the past as well, to curate the memory of violence so it supports current legitimacy. Think about what that means for every empire, every state that uses punishment as control. The cruelty isn't the anomaly. The cruelty is the system working as designed. And the erasure, the gaps in the record, those aren't cover-ups of individual crimes. They're maintenance. Editing the receipts so the machine can keep running without people asking too many questions about what it's built on. Rome didn't fall because it was too cruel. It fell for 100 other reasons: economic, military, political. But the punishments it used to maintain order, the systematic violence coded into law, those patterns didn't disappear. They got inherited. Medieval Europe took Roman law and adapted it. Early modern states used Roman precedents to justify their own violence. The United States founders studied Roman governance, including its legal structures. The machinery doesn't die, it gets refurbished. So when you hear about punishments being erased from history, understand what that actually means. It's not that they never happened. It's that the people who maintained the records decided those particular details weren't useful anymore. The violence continues, just with different justifications, different targets, different procedures. But the fundamental logic, that the state can sort bodies into hierarchies and punish them accordingly, that logic is Roman, and it never went away. Hit like and subscribe if this changed how you see the architecture of power. Drop a comment. What modern legal practice do you think has Roman roots that most people don't recognize? Because next time, we're looking at the medieval punishment that made even the Inquisition uncomfortable, and why it was used not by religious authorities, but by merchants. The connection will disturb you. And that is what really happened.